Oh, and you'll be on for an hour and a half. So if you need to get any refreshments or take care of business, keep that in mind. Of course, you can always pause your camera and disappear later. But we're going
Somebody
on.
figure out that button for you that you're using.
Exactly. It's right above the 7. It kind of looks like a camera with a slash across it. Watch. See. Welcome to IdeaTo IPO. My name is Rob. I organize IdeaTo IPO. We've been doing events in Silicon Valley for many, many years. We launched officially on February 1st, 2010. At that time, we had no members and no events on our calendar. At this stage, we have over 100,000 members among all our meetup groups all around the world. We've organized, promoted, and produced over 2,309 events. By any standard, by any measure, we're the most active, most prolific startup event organization in the history of Silicon Valley, bar none. We produce venture capital panels, legal workshops, networking events, pitch events, and more. Since sheltering in place, we've been doing an event once a day, at least online, Monday through Friday. Check out our schedule at IdeaToIPO.com. At this point, I'm going to pass it off to our distinguished moderator, Roger Royse of Haynes Boone, LLP. Roger, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Rob. Thank you, IdeaTo IPO, for hosting this event and inviting me to moderate this panel. I'm Roger Royse. I'm a partner with Haynes & Boone, an international AmLaw 100 law firm. I'm based out of Palo Alto, resident in the Silicon Valley office. And a couple of housekeeping items before we launch into our topic here today. I see people are still joining. That's fine. That's great. We're going to go ahead and I'll restate the instructions later, but we're going to go for 1 hour of panel discussion with our panel of venture capitalists. If you have questions, you'll notice in the bottom of your screen, there's this little Q&A box. Just go ahead and click on that box, type your question. We'll get to them after the panel. Don't use the chat box, use the Q&A box. Use the chat box if there's something that I need to know immediately, like you can't hear me or something. Otherwise, use the Q&A box. So this is one of a series. I moderate a lot of panels. I see, as people are populating our participant list here, I see a lot of familiar names. So you probably know this. We do this a lot. And we do a lot of topics. And this is one of our VC panels that we do quite a few on. Today is climate tech. We have other panels coming up. Check the IdeaTo IPO schedule that I'll be involved in. We have one coming up on agriculture technology. We have another one coming up on autonomous vehicles. That technology has really been taking off. Hear from the VCs, hear from the experts as to what's going on. But for today, we're talking about climate tech. We're going to touch on the current global economic and health crisis and how energy and environment are being impacted. Do you remember all the discussion about climate change a while ago? It seems like a distant memory now. Those issues are still out there. Those technologies are still being developed. And I will tell you that anecdotally, it's kind of interesting. We were talking earlier with the panel about the last time we had, I guess, a special time period like this about 12 years ago. And I remember seeing a lot of energy technologies come out of that. And it seems like it's happening again. And it seems like some of the things that might have been ahead of their time before are seeing a resurgence. Just personally, I'm seeing a lot of cool solar technologies. Geothermal is back. Things for the oil and for the oil patch are back, different energy efficiencies. That's my perspective, but I'm not the expert. We have a panel of VCs who are. So let me introduce our panel. Carolin Funk, she's the investment director at Blue Bear Capital. She's involved in investing activities with a focus on blockchain, AI, IoT solutions for renewable energy, grid, and mobility. She spent her career supporting renewable energy. So thank you, Carolin. Osama Idrees, he's the investment director at EDF Innovation Lab. He's been there since 2018. He supports the global CVC team and partners with entrepreneurs shaping the future of a carbon neutral and customer focused EDF. I don't know what that is, but I'm sure you're going to explain that to us in a minute when we get to you. Before then, he was at Chevron Technology Ventures, as well as Siemens Global Venture Capital. And we finally also have Sara Chamberlain. She's Managing Director at Energy Foundry. She leads venture investment activity for Energy Foundry. That's an early stage venture fund based in Chicago. She's been instrumental in founding the fund and is the backbone of driving forward the firm and its endeavors, including investments in many of its companies. She sits on many boards of several energy technology companies and has helped raise quite a bit of funding, including non-dilutive funding. I hope we get a chance to talk about that. So before we get kind of into the topics that I think everybody wants to hear about, what I would ask of each of the panelists is maybe you can just give us a little bit of a summary of who you are, a little more than what I've said, how you come to the space, what you're investing in, and what we can expect. And why don't we start with you, Osama?
Okay, thanks, Roger, and thanks for inviting me over. So I work for EDF Innovation Lab. So EDF is the Electricité de France. It's the French electric utility. So by far the largest energy and utility player in France, but also in the UK, Belgium, and Italy. EDF supplies about 30 million people with power. Over 90% of it is renewable, primarily through nuclear and hydro legacy assets, but more and more with renewable projects such as solar, wind, and other technologies as well. The company is quite active in the US, performing business activities around, again, renewable project development, but also in the energy trading part of the value chain and energy efficiency for warehouses and supermarkets and different end customers. My role is within the lab. We sit in Los Altos in the Bay Area. It's one of the international R&D centers for EDF. So EDF has about 6 international R&D centers in the UK, Germany, Singapore, China, and the Bay Area. I'm personally tasked with connecting with the innovation ecosystem in North America, finding startups and innovation that's happening outside of the R&D organization by entrepreneurs, by other external players, and finding the best way to partner or invest or leverage that into a business relationship with our business units. We have a team. So I'm in the US, I'm kind of a team of 2. We have my colleague and myself, but the corporate VC team of EDF is very active in Europe as well. And we are limited partners in multiple funds in Europe, the US, and China. So really happy to be here. And what got me here is just background. I've spent about 10 years working in the energy space with 2-year stint with Siemens, looking more around IoT and advanced manufacturing and how technology can really disrupt legacy systems and legacy industries in a way that bring a lot of value. I'm passionate about getting our systems in a much more efficient, cleaner, sustainable way, whether it's production system, utilization systems, delivery systems, and really looking forward for this panel and being here. So that's it.
Okay, thanks very much. By the way, you might want to adjust your camera just a little high. It's kind of cutting your head off there.
There you go. Thanks
okay. Carolin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, thanks Rob and IdeaTo IPO to have me on the panel here. Yeah, really excited to talk to you more about energy, but trying to bring the energy to the table here. First with my background. I spent the last 16 years working on energy related topics in the broadest sense. I'm originally from Germany, that's hence the accent. And I started off back very much in the clean tech 1.0 era, researching advanced biofuels. I'm doing a PhD on lignocellulose-based biofuels. Yeah, that got me into the broader energy picture and really interested in thinking about how are we going to power our world? How are we going to fuel the cars in the future? How is the energy future going to look like? And in Germany, all that was very policy driven. So after a couple of years in working on policy, I decided I wanted to be a little more entrepreneurial and understand the entrepreneurial drivers that could bring forward this change, and moved to the Bay Area. I also worked at Siemens for a couple of years. That's how I met Osama, actually. So we've overlapped there a little bit, and then moved on to the startup operations side myself, spending a couple of years in 2 energy storage plus software businesses, taking them from seed through Series A, through getting significant government grants, non-dilutive funding as well, and that got me, close to the venture capital industry, and that's how I met the Blue Bear team, and I've been supporting the Blue Bear team for the last 2 years now, and happy to go more into detail on any of that, but just give you a little pitch on what we do at Blue Bear. We invest in software and data-driven business models for the energy supply chain. So not the kind of chemical research and not the new type of solar panels, hardware, but really focusing on how can we make the installation that we have in the field or the ones that we're developing more efficient, increase operational excellence there. And seed-wise, we invest in usually seed to Series A, sometimes Series B. And location-wise, I am based in Berkeley. More of our team is in LA. We have team members in Houston, New York, and London. So we focus on North America and Europe for our investments. Happy to talk about portfolio companies and how this all comes about during our conversation today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sara?
Hi, everyone. Sara Chamberlain with Energy Foundry. Like my fellow panelists, I've spent almost all of my career in energy and in sustainability in some way, first in consulting and working and going out and visiting a lot of industrial facilities and trying to wrap my head around the fact that there had to be a better way from an environmental impact standpoint. And so went and did my MBA and fell into clean tech or climate tech as the place that I wanted to really dig in and focus my efforts. I spent some time with GE in their renewable energy business, working on a solar strategy project with sort of a view into how big companies make investments in startups. And from there, I ended up taking a right turn. I finished my MBA in 2009 when the industry had sort of, the economy had collapsed, and some of the same trends that we're seeing today were happening, and ended up in DC working at a law firm that is also out there in the Bay Area, Wilson Sonsini, and had my chance to work directly with hundreds of clean tech startups. And I caught the bug and thought, for sure, I'm going to find one of these companies that is the one, and I'll go work for them. And I ended up flipping onto the other side into venture. I came to Chicago to help co-found Energy Foundry. The opportunity was too attractive to pass up. And we are an early stage evergreen fund. So somewhat of a unique structure, especially in this industry. Our 2 LPs, although they're not traditional LPs in the sense that there is no return of capital to them, we function a lot more like a family office where we have the capital, we're making investments just like any other venture fund, but as we have success, the capital comes back and we can recycle it and redeploy it into other investments. So we've been doing this model now for about 8 years. We've made about 18 investments and had 4 successful exits thus far. So we're starting to make that evergreen model work and prove that it is indeed possible, especially when you invest in things that are not just software. So we will do hardware, we'll do advanced materials, we'll do, of course, software and unique business models. But we really tend to dig in and work very closely with the companies Our check size varies anywhere from a couple 100,000 up to $1 million, and we reserve follow-on capital behind that. It's exciting for me, especially to see kind of the evolution, and I think we'll talk about some of this and how things have changed in the last 12 years. And it's a great time to be an entrepreneur that's sort of on the edge of exploration and dipping their toe in the water in a new industry, a massive industry where there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of need for technology and innovation. And even now where there's a lot more capital around the table that is willing to invest in and support these types of businesses. So with that, I will hand it back to our esteemed moderator.
So Sara, you used a dirty word there. You know, I'm going to have to caution you here. You said clean tech, I think, and I remember a time when people they got away from that. And of course, even now we call it climate tech. So why don't we stay with you for a minute, because you'd been around during 2008, you know, during the last rush into energy technologies. What's the difference? What is climate tech, and why do we call it climate tech instead of clean tech these days?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the marketing around all of this, I think, is more of a driver for me for the way that we define climate tech. It's a very broad category, and it includes things beyond just what folks maybe know about, like wind or solar generation, new sources of power that are quote unquote clean. For us, climate tech is anything that is going to improve the environmental position of our world, right? How do we reduce carbon? How do we increase renewable energy? How do we do it all in a way that creates economic value instead of, you know, relying on sources that are dirty but cheap, right? And so it's a very broad category. And even things that you may not think of as quote unquote, you know, climate tech or energy, you know, there's lots of avenues because it is such a big industry that for us, it encompasses manufacturing. It encompasses a lot of products, the embodied carbon content of making cars or making insulation panels or making, you know, paint, right? There's lots of ways to think about how a product has room for improvement when it comes to the environmental footprint.
Yeah, to add to that, just even being able to track some of the things that Sara just mentioned require new ways of looking at things, new sensors, new ways of tracking, and so yeah, it's a big space.
And I think just to add one more thing, like the 2008 activity really brought in new generation technology mostly that required a lot of capital to replace or substitute other heavy generation technology, whether it's coal or gas or oil. It seems to me what I see today in the market is, you know, sustainability expands beyond that. It's into the supply chain, it's into agriculture, it's into utilization, the business model, city planning, mobility as a, you know, all the things that happen with mobility. So it's a much broader application of the term. I think ESG is a nice term to use. We'll see if it sticks, but, you know, I've heard of funds and even our own reason to be is around how can we decarbonize our activity. So beyond the generation part and beyond replacing the original fossil fuel infrastructure. It's in manufacturing, it's in design, it's in real estate. It really is kind of a lot more broader, which again, by definition, then enables a lot more talented people and entrepreneurs to play a role if they're really targeting those impacts. So I think that's also a difference in how funds then can structure their portfolio, hopefully more successful, generating more and better sustainable returns to feed back into the investment cycle compared to the first let's say clean tech 1.0.
Yeah. So on that, would you say then that this is kind of a growing and big and new industry and an area for opportunity for our entrepreneur audience to maybe get involved in? And if so, maybe you could talk a little bit to the panel about what's driving that. Why now? You know, why this? Why is this a thing? Anybody?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm very convinced, spending all time and money on this. This is happening right now, I think the opportunity is really a once in a generation opportunity, that we are rethinking the way we are consuming energy. And there are trillions of dollars with a T being spent to make this transition into all aspects of the infrastructure and just in general the industry. So it's a fast growing and fast changing world that we live in on the energy side right now. Just to give you one example, when I started looking at energy storage technologies, we're talking about like $1,000 per kilowatt hour prices of batteries, and now we're talking about 100 or maybe even 70. So there's so much fast change happening here that we see it's a big opportunity. And just to go one step back to the climate tech part, I think this rebranding was more needed for some of the bigger funds rather than the folks that you have here on the panel, the bigger funds who lost a lot of money in the clean tech 1.0 space from their LPs. So they're thinking, how do we call this now? Do we call it energy? Do we call it clean tech? Do we call it something else? And so I think climate tech came out of that rebranding.
Carolin, are you saying it's a technological thing? The technologies have come along now, or maybe people can make money at it? And
just taking us back to like 2007, 2008, we didn't have an iPhone then. We didn't have Amazon web servers. We didn't have any cloud computing. We didn't have IoT. We didn't have like the connectivity that we have right now. This together with the cost down that I talked about, that's happened on solar and wind already, storage is happening right now, is driving this change. It's not driven by policy anymore. It's not driven by subsidies anymore. Solar is the cheapest source of energy in much of the world right now, and not even talking about saving the climate here. It's just making people a lot of money and taking other energy generation technologies out of the world.
Yeah, I think the first or even second wave, depending on how you look at it, a lot of it was about the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure, and things like getting the cost of wind turbines down, bringing the cost of solar panels down, innovating on the layers of material that comprise a panel. And now that has reached a maturity plateau, you have a new wave of innovations on top of those for things like managing those solar assets, controlling them remotely, optimizing them. You have tools and services not just for end consumers, commercial investors, financial investors in those assets. So there's a whole new layer of innovations that have come on the backs of the reductions in the main infrastructure costs. EVs is another example where, getting the cost of the batteries down is a huge driver for electric vehicle adoption. And now there's a new wave of innovations around shared mobility. How do you optimize EV charging in cities and not just corporate fleets? How do you think about that next layer of services that sits on top of those, large infrastructure investments?
Let me follow up on that a little bit, because Carolin, you said something kind of interesting. You said it's not really the policy that's driving it. California's had a renewable portfolio standard for a long time, and I thought that's what really drove a lot of the innovation in all sorts of energy technologies. I think I'm hearing that it's more technology, but on the demand side of this, what's going on in the market? Has things changed in the energy markets that might be creating opportunities for some of these technologies? And I know all three of you, I think you said that you invest in some of the markets or supply chain or some of the technologies that are further downstream. So maybe you can speak to that. As an example, let me kind of expand on that. We used to say that it was LNG that kind of just, determined everything that happened in energy when, LNG was priced high, liquefied natural gas was priced high. There was a lot of room to innovate and come up with different types of energy. Is it that sort of thing now? Would you say the markets for energy have changed much?
Osama, you spend so much time in,
Yes.
even in the Houston area, the
Right.
kind of epicenter of energy in the US.
I think definitely there is, and I wouldn't say a sudden shift. That shift has been going on for quite some time with the shale activity and how the pricing model and the risk model of onshore, production has got to a point where it's clear that even for oil and gas companies, especially like the large majors internationally, they need to shift their financing capital structure, their mechanism of pricing, and they understand that they need to shift from the total kind of concentration of oil and gas. But thinking kind of to the question of what has changed, is it technology, is it policy? I think it's all of the above, really. And it's the realization that some of this technology can have an impact today, and there's a lot of value to be captured today, and that there is value in being a first mover for some of these big companies. I would add and recognize that the shift from the corporations, especially the tech companies, and really pushing forward with their own goals around where they procure and consume and how they want to operate their energy systems, led to a lot more capital, a lot more interest from kind of across the value chain to support and enhance that as well. But if we look just at what big corporations are doing, if you look at it, right now I work for a utility, very old legacy type company. What are we looking for? We're looking for how we could offer new services for our customers. Okay, so we serve you electricity. We're going to try to make it as clean as possible. That's our goal. That's our mission. But from an innovation and finding new revenue models, where is that coming from? So even for a utility, we're not necessarily spending most of our time, maybe in R&D we are, of the best next multi-junction thin film company out there. But we're also very, very kind of deeply looking into startups and entrepreneurs who have different ways of offering services to the customer, enabling new revenue models, enabling new business models that then we as a big company could leverage or partner with as well. So I think it goes beyond, oh, now the lithium, cost is going down, so all of a sudden everything opened up. I think that transition is happening all the time, but it does open avenues for people to look for opportunities, whether it's, like I mentioned, and like Sara was mentioning, like there's a lot more now, layers on top of layers on top of layers that you could create value. And I think it's a great opportunity for entrepreneurs to go after.
Yeah, I think it's definitely technology driven and a set of entrepreneurs that are approaching it in a more capital efficient manner. One of the things that we look back at sort of the wave of folks who invested the first go around in clean tech companies is that as folks were working on those big problems, like how do you bring the cost of a solar panel down? At the end of the day, the real competition that folks need to have on their radar is not that, it's a solar panel and so people will buy it because it's solar, because it's thin film or SIGs or a specific type of material, because at the end of the day, it's an electron. And so if you can't compete with the next cheapest electron, it doesn't matter if it's solar, wind, fuel cells, whatever it is. And so there's a shift that had to happen in the broader market on how do we use technology to bring costs to be competitive with the next cheapest electron. And that frame, I think, is part of what drove such innovation over the last decade. And also because there was a lot of investors that were stepping away from making new investments in early stage technology companies, it was that much harder to raise money. And so in a world where only the top 1% of businesses are getting funded, it was even harder. And so getting that first chance, there was a really high burden of proof. At least that's the way we were looking at companies, right? You had to be able to show that there was an economic case for your business. It wasn't enough to capture users and eyeballs and clicks. You needed to have a path to show that you could be profitable if your product could come to market. And if you can't prove that, then it wasn't a good fit for us. So I think all of those things coming together now is sort of hopefully a lesson that has been learned for a lot of folks, and we can take a fresh approach on investing in this space.
So Osama, you said you do a lot of R&D here in your facility in the U.S. Can you talk a little bit maybe about some of the exciting, new, and interesting? Because this is all about. I'm hearing this is all about technology, is what I'm hearing so far, and business models, of course. But what are some of the I guess outside of what's going on in oil and gas, what are some of the kind of the new technologies and new advances that are being made that we think might have a big influence in this sector?
So sure, yeah. So just a correction. So in our lab in Los Altos, we don't necessarily have a lot of the R&D activity. Most of the R&D activity, whether it's the wet lab, the bench shop, the material science, is actually mostly in France. In terms of the real principal R&D that is going on at EDF, I think there's a lot of activity or a lot more attention is being kind of focused on carbon capture and how can you make that at scale, or can you? The ever ongoing question about hydrogen, and would it be potentially a real pathway for decarbonization of heavy industries, again, like heavy transportation, heavy manufacturing, and is there a way to really capture that and bring it to the market and to our customers sooner? EDF does operate quite a bit of a huge nuclear fleet, so there is definitely a lot of R&D activity going there to at least make sure that those assets and facilities continue to operate to the longest duration possible. So this way you could extend the life significantly, which for the region of France and Europe will make a huge impact on the carbon reduction goals they have. From the innovation side and the venture capital side, I think we are focusing more around how can we extend our services to our customers beyond energy, like I mentioned. So we're looking at, could we help our customers with their mobility needs? Could we help our customers with their real estate needs, with their health needs, with their financial needs? We do have a big infrastructure and a big footprint in many regions in the world, and maybe there's a way for us to leverage that and create more value beyond the delivery of electrons.
Okay. Carolin or Sara, you want to comment on specific technologies? I know you've already mentioned quite a few of them, but is there anything that we want to expand on?
Yeah, so for us, it's really applying a lot of the kind of more typical Silicon Valley technologies to the energy industry. So the application of artificial intelligence, machine learning, IoT, cloud computing, virtual augmented reality, even distributed ledger technologies. How can those technologies that have been proven or are on the path to be proven in other sectors, can you as an entrepreneur show us that this can be used? And we're sure it can, just needs to find the right applications in the energy industry in the broadest sense. One area that we've been specifically excited and just made our last investment in is kind of the future of work type area, where we're seeing that there's something happening that we call the great crew change. So just folks out in the field reaching their retirement age, and now companies trying to replace them with new workers, train up those workers, or having a hard time finding those people. And so technologies that can help kind of transfer the knowledge and sustain the knowledge inside the company in some way is, for example, an area that I think doesn't sound very intuitive in terms of, yeah, that's kind of energy and climate tech investing, but it's really necessary. You see kind of the solar farms and wind turbines, actually maintenance workers in that space were the fastest growing jobs in the US pre-COVID. So how can we support those workers is one big question.
I see. So there are needs that are coming up, I guess, around, I guess we'd call them additional industries being developed around climate tech. I can't help noticing there are some wind turbines behind you. And then I see some solar panels too. And when I think of this space and I think of renewables, I think of wind and solar and then geothermal as well. What else is there that we might think about? That you see some opportunities and some growth and some technologies that are building into the market now.
Happy to talk more about that. I think even within wind and solar, I just want to add, we're not done with that. We have bifacial solar, we have floating solar. Of course, we have like offshore wind and floating wind. We have a lot of opportunity in the hydro space. So not just pumped hydro, but can we leverage other types of energy that is kind of encompassed in flowing water. I think Osama talked about hydrogen. I think we all see that hydrogen has a spot. And then there's the big bucket of energy storage that is not just lithium-ion batteries. For electric vehicles, I think they've made the case for themselves and they're the true winners, but for more seasonal storage, longer term duration storage, we're going to have the whole spectrum from capacitors to, I don't know, large flow batteries. It's, yeah, the sky's the limit. If you want to work on energy storage, I think there's a lot to explore and a lot of money kind of flow into that space.
Yeah, storage, I can also echo that's an interesting space, is the kind of the close cousin, right, with the massive installed base that's come online in both wind and solar. It's a big frontier. It's a big opportunity. We also see a lot in energy efficiency, and that is, I mean, a very fragmented, untapped opportunity. We have quite a few investments in that space, mostly in software, some of them hardware enabled solutions, but I mean, it runs the gamut.
And I would, yeah, the energy efficiency aspect and approach to really optimizing and you know, better use of the renewable energy system that we will have, I think is a great opportunity. You know, it's great news that solar and wind are reaching the penetration ratio that people are getting excited about, but it also is an opportunity to better optimize that and make sure to leverage and kind of valorize that the best way possible so that you don't have curtailment for any reason. So energy efficiency, grid modernization, better interconnection, and better pricing models and revenue models for this new generation is a great area. And we see a lot of technologies there helping to really get the grid to be more distributed, better monetized, and really kind of bring in more and more renewable into the mix from all these different sources. And again, I would just have to say energy efficiency remains to be a huge area for innovation and revenue potential and value add for really everybody involved, if it's done right and if you can find the right approach to scale and grow, because it is very localized, fragmented market at the end of the day.
Localized and fragmented, and the distribution system in the United States, of course, is just a big mess. I hope you can fund some smart entrepreneur that can come up with the AI solution or the software that can straighten that out. So on that point, let me shift gears a little bit and talk about the funding environment a little bit. We talked about the market, we talked about the technology. Are we entering an age where there's a lot of funding available for this? Osama, you talked about industrial and how big companies now are putting resources into this. Are there, because our entrepreneurs in the audience, I know they're going to want to know, if I go build something, is someone going to help pay for it? Is someone going to fund it? Are you seeing a lot of interest in this? I mean, obviously you folks invest in this, but is this something that, you know, that is getting its share of the pie in terms of funding dollars, especially here in Silicon Valley?
I would say yes, definitely. I have no hesitation to say there is, from all sources of capital, really, from the venture funds, from the corporate venture capital, from project finance type organizations that are really have been missing the first time around, that enable some of these longer term go-to-market, you know, commercialization pilot, your first or second, that is difficult to get through venture. Now there's definitely a lot more avenues and more tailored financing, you know, ability for entrepreneurs to go after. It's not any easier just because there's more capital out there. You still have to have a good case, and you still have to have the right solution and do the work, because all these different entities still have different horizons and different expectation of what they want to see. But yes, in terms of the funding for technologies that better enable more equitable energy system or utilization of all what we do, I would say definitely more than you would expect.
There's a really good blog post that the guys from SJF Ventures put together. I want to say it was Dave Kirkpatrick. If you Google it, SJF, like list of energy or impact investors, and he sort of lays out a whole laundry list of names and funds, everyone from, you know, the various categories that Osama just mentioned. And for us, I mean, we made our first investment in 2013, and we sort of looked to our left and looked to our right, and there was nobody, like no venture funds. It was, you know, a lot of angel investors, a handful of corporates. We saw a lot of corporate venture funds pop up over the last 5 years. It'll be interesting now to see the evolution of those groups. There are still more being announced. And then there's quite a few accelerators across the country, and some even with a global model that are expanding into the US. Clean Tech Open is a Silicon Valley-based business plan competition that's been around for, you know, multiple decades, that has a fantastic network. So I think depending on where folks are on their journey of exploring this, there are resources, communities, investors, and ways to access your customer. And I think if I can't underscore it enough that in all the flavors of funding, the one that is the most valuable to you as an entrepreneur is customer funding. And I think what we've seen is customers are a lot more willing to engage than if you are really solving a pain point for them. There are a lot more that are willing to explore the idea of some type of joint development contract or paid pilot or exchanging value in some way, so that you're not just automatically going to a venture investor or an angel investor to get to some meaningful proof point. And so I think now especially is a great time to explore those kinds of investors.
Sara, tell me a little bit more about that. I noticed in your bio you had raised quite a bit of money in non-dilutive financing.
Yeah.
What is that? It sounds really good. And where do I get some of it?
So my history, that is 99% government grants. As part of the 2009 stimulus, the ARA funding that came out. I worked with entrepreneurs on federal and state programs, on grants, and also the big loan guarantee program. It was a time that was sort of unprecedented. It also really distorted the market because investors were looking at Washington and saying, there's a lot of money up for grabs. We got to go get some. And no matter how far along someone was in their maturity or their commercialization cycle, you know, the prize was the multi-$100 million loan guarantee, right? Debt and then grant funding to fund that credit subsidy risk. And it was an expensive and lengthy process, but if you could be successful out the other end, it could fund your plant. It could fund, you know, the thing that most businesses were attempting to do, which is either build a big project or set up manufacturing for a new solar or wind or you know, waste heat capture, whatever the device was. And so this time around, I think there is likely to be additional opportunity. There's always been non-dilutive funding opportunities. I think it was just a time where the spotlight was being shown on Washington and the fact that, you know, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, or EERE, has an annual budget of like $3 billion. And during the stimulus, they had another like 20 billion that they had to put out. So on top of their annual appropriation. And I think all of a sudden people realize, gosh, we spend a lot of money on R&D in this country. We ought to try and go get some of that. So it was very, very competitive. It was very challenging for companies to actually show that there was a fit with the program goals. And I spent a lot of time telling companies why they shouldn't waste their time and energy applying. So I think there is, you know, plenty of grant money that's still out there, but folks need to be very cautious in applying for it so that, you know, you don't go through the same pain of go hire a consultant for, you know, $20, $50, $200,000 and have nothing to show for it at the end of the day because you're just simply not a good fit. But it is complex, and I'm happy to talk to anyone in more detail about that.
This is federal money or state or both?
Both.
Oh, okay.
Both. Primarily federal that I was involved in.
And there are still grants around. If
Yes.
it's state grants, so I've actually have a decent track record with California Energy Commission grants here in California, but the Department of Energy with their ARPA-E grants and such. So if you are in the space, be really smart and look around and talk to people. Now there are also a lot more organizations who can be helpful, even within like national labs or, you know, other research organizations that will be kind of helpful to talk to and look at, either work together with them and have them do some of the heavy lifting and kind of trying to get to the grant funding, or just see their track records and
Yeah.
how that has developed.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good thing, I guess, it is a good thing if we see entrepreneurs that have started to explore that landscape. It doesn't mean if they have to have been awarded grant money for it to be attractive, but if they have gotten some money, it's a good signal to us.
And to the general kind of, there's funding out there, I would think about, if you start a company, think about two different ways of thinking about your markets. Are you like, is energy the industry or that kind of slice where you really want to be deep into one vertical? Are you a solar company, or are you going to be like a company that does kind of grid technologies or such? So is that like, are you trying to nail that one vertical, or are you broader? Are you a more horizontal company? And depending on which one you are, there are different types of funding for you. And I will say that if you're looking at the kind of big Silicon Valley names in the VC space, they will be active in both, but it will be much harder if you're on the kind of, we call it the nail the vertical kind of track, to really make people understand that this market is big enough. So you'd rather probably come to folks like Sara, Osama, or me, and who can help you with that narrative.
So speaking of how big the market is, I want to talk a little bit about that, especially geographically. We have attendees here now that are from around the world, and a lot of times the comments we get from our attendees is that, you know, we tend to be a little myopic on Silicon Valley focused. Is this a Silicon Valley topic, or is this a global topic? I know, Osama, you've got a facility in France, and Sara, you're in Chicago, I think. But is this the kind of thing that entrepreneurs around the world can get involved in and still have an opportunity in a market and an investment source and a funding source, et cetera? Or are we really talking about something that maybe is a little more local? I heard one of you say local earlier, and I think you're talking about the markets more than the opportunity. Can you speak to, you know, to the geographical restrictions?
So when for example, like talking about energy efficiency, I think the market is global for sure. If in all reality, actually, the energy cost in the US is much cheaper than many other locations outside of the US. It's a lot more expensive and maybe even less reliable over there. So the value of a better solution or better technology is more pronounced. In terms of funding and kind of where entrepreneurs can find funding, there's no denying kind of the ecosystem here in North America, and in particular in Silicon Valley, is very big and very active. But I would say solutions that can impact agriculture, solutions that can impact, again, energy use and energy optimization, and very close to our business is the microgrid applications for developing worlds, solar plus a battery that could really provide electricity, clean electricity for people who might not have the existing infrastructure. That is something that we always have an eye on, energy access and things of that nature. But I would be missed to speak to say that yes, everywhere in the world there is opportunity for people to get funding. I think the talent is everywhere and the opportunity is everywhere, but different ecosystems have kind of a leg up there. I've read recently, like maybe hopefully many people read that organizations like Google and other big funding institutions are trying to kind of expand their ability to invest in entrepreneurs outside of the U.S. So that's a great sign. And maybe stepping back, if companies like Microsoft, like they announced as well, that they want to, I don't know the right term, decarbonize their impacts through their lifetime, they really would not necessarily be able to remove that much carbon from the air just by doing projects in Seattle and Silicon Valley. They will end up having to do and go to markets where they could really bring an impact in carbon reduction, probably all over the world. So it's a good sign, and maybe it will open up more opportunity. But yeah, I mean, for an entrepreneur who is in a region where maybe there's not enough funding or there's not enough kind of legal infrastructure to do venture capital work, it is hard. It is very difficult. And I hope to support them, but I don't have any tips on top of my mind.
Anybody else want to speak to that? Well, if not, Osama, you've mentioned agriculture a couple of times now.
Right.
One of my favorite topics. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what the problem is in agriculture and, and again, problems are opportunities here, right? What the problems are to be solved, especially as it relates to the carbon footprint that big ag has in the world.
So from EDF perspective, it's an area that we're looking at to see how can we provide, again, better systems to, and in particular, if we can electrify more and more of the existing infrastructure that is used, using technologies for aerial inspection or satellite imagery or things like that that could provide a lot of value, and setting up the right infrastructure for our agriculture customers. I don't necessarily have a particular use case defined yet, so we'd love to hear more from you. What you think is the kind of the key opportunity there in agriculture, or where should we look into?
To me? Oh, well, I got plenty of ideas on that. I think it's exactly what everybody said. It's taking traditional technologies or taking other technologies from other industries and applying them here. I mean, what robotics is doing to I don't know if it's climate, but it certainly is reducing the use of chemicals. We've got we all know about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. That's something that can be solved really through robotics, not just taking chemicals out of the system. And that's definitely going to happen. So a lot of imaging companies out there for sure. Drones, planes above the canopy, below the canopy. It's a really defragmented and exciting space. But I think as it relates to what we're talking about here today, I've always thought that agriculture and carbon sequestration could go hand in hand. I think a lot of those technologies could be applied in the same way. And we haven't even talked about the ocean yet. So I want to talk about the ocean because I feel like, we should have probably hit that at some point here. Because I have seen companies that are, believe it or not, working on technologies that can monitor, temperatures throughout the ocean and not only just saving the oceans from all the bad things that are going on, but also having a real impact on global climate change. But
and maybe to get that, like one more word on the transition from agriculture to the ocean, just the energy water nexus. And how much agriculture is just a huge consumer of water, also electricity, but just around probably 20% of the water that we're pumping around never reaches. It's destiny. It gets lost somewhere in the system. So, and that also consumes energy in one sense or another. And then we kind of set aside the whole drought problem that we have in a lot of areas of this world, including California. So just kind of thinking about the combined energy and water kind of systems, and then add to that the carbon kind of system that we're more and more developing and taking into account. There are lots of exciting problems to solve.
Yeah, and some of these technologies, okay, I'm going to say something really controversial, and people are going to hate me for this, but some of them are creating problems, especially in urban agriculture. I mean, I want you to think about this because I see a lot of companies in this space. Imagine you've got in indoor urban agriculture, you got to supply so much energy to create that indoor egg, to create those, you know. Now I know there's workarounds and there's solar and there's this and that, but the earlier systems, think about this, you would have artificial light, you know, replacing sunlight so you could have light for your tomatoes indoors. And then you'd have, and of course you got water and, you know, inputs and everything, but huge footprint, huge, you know, carbon footprint. And I know there are companies out there, you know, dealing with that. So that's my aside. So you know what, with the time we've got left here, we're getting towards the end. I wonder if each of you just maybe give me a minute or two on what the future is going to be, the near-term future for climate tech. What do you think we're going to see, you know, in the coming months and years, and what we're going to be hearing about, because you're there at ground zero, you see it before the rest of us. What's exciting and new that we can expect to hear about? Osama, I think I'll start with you since you're on the left hand of my screen.
Well, I think we'll continue hearing more. I think more and more corporations and traditional players committing to improve our sustainable planet that we live in and we all share. So in terms of, I think that's the great news. The technology challenges that we will be, I think, hearing more and more about continues to be electric vehicle, in my opinion. I think it will be the headlines for quite some time, and followed kind of, I think, after that was automation. I think the way we automate our manufacturing, supply chain, work, even our meeting right here is going to drive a lot of value and technology innovation across the board. And yeah, hope maybe not too far away in the future, we'll get some wireless power technology that can solve a lot of the inefficiencies in the grid, and we'll see. And I will pass it to Sarah, since I talked first.
So I think we are going to see a lot more storage in the market beyond just electric vehicles. I think we're going to see behind the meter. I think we're going to see grid integration of renewables using storage in a big way. I think I'm hopeful that we'll see some emerging solutions for energy efficiency, and how do we pick up all the pennies that are out there? How do we find a business model that works? How do we find a team that can scale quickly? And how do we find some solutions there, because it's a big opportunity. And I think similarly, I think we're going to see really strong companies, because anybody that is building a business in the current climate is going to have to be lean and focused and very, very closely collaborating with their customer. So where you think you might be solving a problem in this corner, by the time you realize where your value is, you've moved all the way over here. And hopefully they'll be able to kind of leapfrog in that process instead of spending a lot of time and dollars digging in a hole that, you know, there's not really going to be a good fit. So I'm very, very hopeful that we'll find sort of a new class of entrepreneurs that can fail fast and have enough resources left at the end of the day to take a new start on something.
Carolyn, you get the last word, it looks like.
I get the last word here. So first of all, to add on to what Osama and Sara said, I think we're going to electrify everything. Full electrification of homes, of buildings, of cars, of agricultural equipment. That's going to be one trend. And then I think no matter what happens in November, we'll see either a big infrastructure package, or we'll see a big package into energy and environment. So if you're working on energy infrastructure, I think there is a path forward, and we've already seen what's happening in Europe on that end. So it's moving forward. We'll see a lot of kind of people digging around on carbon emissions and how to kind of mitigate them, how to capture carbon. But I think that'll kind of drive towards a solution over the next couple of years, and with a lot of kind of carbon offsets that we'll need if the corporates really walk the walk. Then we'll get to solutions probably in the next like 2 or 3 years that really have a meaningful impact.
Okay, and before we get to Q&A, maybe each of you, how do people get a hold of you? Carolin, why don't we stay with you for a second?
Yeah, easiest by email, Carolin, that's with a C and without an E, at bluebearcap.com.
Okay, Sara?
Same email, first initial dot last name at Energy Foundry. Or just be really smart and strategic and network your way in. That's the best way, to be fair. We see about, I don't know, 800 to 1,000 companies a year. We hear probably about a third of their pitches, and the ones that are coming at us cold, you've got to really be standout. But we do look at everything. So we also have on our website, we have a portal if you're interested in submitting your business plan or your pitch deck.
Osama?
Yeah, so I think follow on to that, you know, networking and finding a good path through all the information is always a good thing to do, and it's part of the entrepreneur's job. It should be hard sometimes, not so hard, but sometimes it should be hard. But you know, my first name dot last name at EDF Inc., EDF-Inc., or you can find me on LinkedIn if you just want to send me something as well. I'll take a look at it. Like Sara said, we do look at everything. We might not be able to work on everything though.
Okay, I'm going to go to the Q&A now. If you have a question, type it into the Q&A box. Don't put it into the chat box. It's hard to read. Put it in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to it. If we don't get to it here, I'll pass these along to the panelists. First of all, I want to thank our panel for being here. I always learn a lot here. Thanks very much. That was really informative and really interesting. I'm Roger Royse. I'm your moderator. I'm a partner with Haynes & Boone, international law firm based in Palo Alto, California. So we have one question that's come up over and over and over again. So I'm going to take that one first. How do I get you guys to invest in me is basically what it is. I think you've already answered that. You've given people your contact information. So make sure that you follow up with our panelists. So let me start with maybe, I don't know if it's a softball, but kind of a broad question is, generally, how do we keep the future of climate tech to be different than the future of clean tech? What's going to bring investors back into this space after what happened, 10 years ago? Anybody want to take that?
Such a great question. It's such a great question. I think the biggest thing that can ensure success with climate tech, that people don't have that aftertaste in their mouth, is for companies to really think carefully about how they fund their businesses. I think one of the #1 lessons is not to overcapitalize, because these businesses are not likely to IPO. They're not likely to be acquired for $1 billion. So you can't raise $500 million in venture capital. So you need to really think about what is the most capital efficient way for you to achieve some value inflection point. And that is, if that can then create some winners, right? Some big success stories of companies that are acquired in the multi-$100 million mark, then I think, all you need is some success. And as a sector, I think we need to be better about talking about that success as well, because everyone sort of rolls their eyes today and says, oh, the venture model is not a good fit for, capital intensive industries with very long sales cycles. And we actually think there's a way to make it work if you build your business in the right way.
Anybody else? Okay, have a specific question here about graphene in batteries, because this is something, and I think Carolyn, you said you do materials. We've been hearing about this wonder material, the graphene, for a long time. Can you talk a little bit about how that's coming along, and if you know, how the market's doing and how the investment market in particular for these sorts of, I guess, materials generally.
Materials.
Yeah, so we don't do invest in materials. I spend a number of years working in battery application companies, so also not building kind of battery cells, anodes, cathodes. Disclaimer, I'm not that deep in the materials. I think if you want to make a breakthrough in the battery space right now, especially if you're targeting lithium ion batteries, make sure that whatever you're developing fits in with the current manufacturing process. Because companies have built out manufacturing facilities that have significant room for growth and demand, to say the least, built for kind of the big spike in EV. So make sure whatever you're building fits in with those processes. It's going to be really hard if you have a new material and then you need an additional process. But otherwise, I think if you can save money during battery manufacturing, or if you can be more sustainable, there's, for example, a company also back in Europe, Northvolt, who's really trying to build the sustainable battery. So they'd be open talking to you for sure if you have good solutions there.
Okay.
One thing to maybe add from my personal experience, you know, technologies that, especially in the energy space, not necessarily just climate, but you know, energy is $1 trillion market. And I've seen a lot of companies or entrepreneurs who would have an idea or a solution that would say it could improve yield or reduce inefficiencies or that by, let's say, you know, 3 to 5%. And if you multiply that by the huge base of the energy used, it sounds like a magnificent, magnificent opportunity. But what I would always kind of tell them back, and it's not necessarily applies in all cases, but something to keep in mind, but for each of your customers, it's still 3 to 5% for their activity. And sometimes that is not significant enough for them to change the way they do things, the way they operate. So yes, if you improve our energy consumption as a planet by 1 to 2%, that's huge. But if I come to you and try to convince you to change something or buy something that improve your ability within that range, it's not significant enough. So when it comes to materials or new solutions, especially in processes and industries, where a new catalyst or a new formation could do something that improved operation by 1 to 3% or 3 to 5%, yes, if everybody uses it all the time, it makes sense. But for every one of your customers, it might not be enough. And keeping that in mind and finding then the right customers whose that problem for them is significant enough is probably the way to go. So if you're graphene, then you really need to find out, you know, the battery makers. Going to the automobile or an energy company like myself who buys big a storage system, 3 to 5% might not be significant enough for us to do anything with it. Just as a note there.
Okay. So we had a question. Somebody asked about China. They said they won the cost down race in Clean Tech 1.0. Won't that happen again as their space beyond software? I don't know what that means, but that kind of leads me into the bigger question about, I know a couple of you invest in AI, and we often talk about how China's ahead of us in AI. Is the U.S. dominating this space? Is the U.S. dominating climate tech and clean tech, or is it someplace else? And if so, who, and what can we do about that? Anybody have an opinion?
So I think, yes, listen, the problem and the challenge with China is that the patterns of the past could certainly repeat themselves. What happened with subsidies in solar, and they're creating huge subsidies in batteries and battery manufacturing. It puts the pressure on, right? It puts the pressure on for our technology to be better, for our entrepreneurs to solve problems in capital efficient ways and to find customers and get to market. So I don't know that we can avoid that happening, but we can be focused on cost. We can be focused on driving efficiency. We can try to lead with manufacturing competitiveness. And I know that there is a big push from a policy perspective and from a manufacturing perspective. How do we enable, especially from Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, there's lots of people looking at this challenge of how do we create resources and programs that can support domestic manufacturing. So it's a big challenge. And that's why part of it comes down to how quickly can we bring some of this stuff to market. The good news is there's been a lot of things that have been incubating for a long time. And we have made great strides in a lot of these technologies. So now that we're at the point that things are ready to actually scale, that's a very different equation. I think if we stopped investing in the R&D on some of these things, that's where we become somewhat vulnerable, that they're going to leapfrog us. But I think I think because of what folks experienced in solar and also in batteries, I think we just have a fundamental new frame for how we think about it.
Yeah, that's good. I remember when China just totally destroyed the photovoltaic market and solar, and I had a lot of solar clients up until then.
Well, the fact is that a lot of these processes can now be fully automated. It doesn't come down to the labor, where that was always thought of as driving most of the cost. And we have a company that is printing it's a new film that functions as the light for a display. So instead of having a backlit display where you go out in the sun and there's a horrible glare and you have to turn up the brightness and it sucks your battery down, now there's a new class of displays that are reflective. And so there's a mirror on the back, and their film functions as that light shining into the mirror. Well, that film is the core IP that can be manufactured roll to roll super, super fast. And then we can ship that overseas and have the rest of the components assembled. So we don't, there's certain things that we need to maintain manufacturing competitiveness here because of the IP. But then we're very happy to have global expansion because it drives economic growth here for that business. So things like that, I think, are also how we ought to be thinking about how do we win this race of speed to market and maintaining some leadership on cost.
Yeah, I totally agree with Sara, and I think we just need. We're in a global competition here. This picture behind me, it could be anywhere in the world, so this is a global competition. We need to be open, talking about those issues. And one I wanted to add is the security issue. We're attaching everything to the internet, and we're not really talking about the cybersecurity aspects of that. This is still a critical infrastructure. This still needs to be, no matter where in the world, people might want to get into it. So I think that kind of compliance and security risk is something that just is already there. We need to address and talk about it more.
Okay. Next question, we had a question about hydrogen. Do you see the biggest near-term opportunity in ground mobility, air mobility, storage for utilities, industrial transport, or green generation? Any of you doing stuff in hydrogen, or do you have an opinion on hydrogen?
Usually my opinion on hydrogen is that a lot more smarter people than me spend all their lives working on hydrogen. But I would say, at least from the EDF activity right now, we definitely see a more near-term potential for point-to-point, like Carolin mentioned in a previous conversation, for heavy transportation. So think trains and ships. I think in terms of many other applications, the modularity, the scale, the variability of load or energy demand makes it still long-term. We do a lot of R&D work in our lab, actually in Los Altos, more theoretical work right now, but I think will prove very useful very soon, where when you are 100% renewable, what is the price of the energy mix going to look like? And in that scenario, where many regions are really hoping to get to by 2040 or 2050, there might be a case for, you know, the overutilization of renewable energy, turning it into hydrogen for what people call green hydrogen. But I think we're still a little bit far away from that, and there's other rate mechanisms that might be deployed to avoid that scenario. So in the near term, from my perspective, I think yes, heavy transportation, if you can, on trains or ships, might be a good way to deploy hydrogen, where it kind of sits securely, safely, utilized from one point to the other in a very efficient way. But would love to hear what Sara and Carolin have in mind as well.
You know, we've seen a lot of deal flow in this space, but we haven't made an investment. Typically what we've seen is that, you know, if you think about the value chain of create, store, transport, use, nobody's been able to make the economic case that they can do it at a cost that is attractive enough to make the longer term investment. And you know, there does appear to have been a resurgence in hydrogen and the interest in hydrogen. Just the other day, we were on the phone with folks from the Gas Technology Institute, and they have a, gosh, I don't remember the number, but I want to say it's at least $40 million effort, and they're looking at government programming that would increase the amount of effort at that, where they're going to look into that exact question of, along that value chain, what are the tipping points? What are the breaking points where it becomes economic and it can start to scale? And what are the technologies that are needed to make that happen? So I think there's a resurgence in activity there. And so, you know, maybe we'll find some interesting learnings out of some of those types of programs, those big sort of hub type programs. There's another idea that folks have been toying with for quite some time, which is using the gas grid to store hydrogen. And there's some debate about from a technology standpoint, and a safety standpoint, what are the thresholds? You know, what do you need for it to be meaningful? But conceptually, it's kind of interesting. We just haven't seen any real evidence that we're there yet. But, you know, just gives you a sense of the universe of things that people are thinking about and talking about.
It's funny that you mentioned that. That was actually one of my last projects I worked on before moving to the US in 2012 in Germany. We called it like power to gas. So using excess wind power, and then turn that into hydrogen and feed it into the gas grid. From an engineer's perspective, it makes me cringe to feed something as clean as hydrogen into the natural gas grid. Natural gas is not like one molecule. It's like a mix of all these different molecules. I'm not a chemist, so excuse my language here, but it's an interesting idea. I will say, having been here in Berkeley for a while now, PG&E actually wants to shut off their gas grid. It's a huge liability. They'd rather get rid of it. So do we want to extend that liability just because we want to use it to feed hydrogen into it? And it wasn't built for hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very complex to handle molecule. So I think, yes, there is this whole spectrum, and there will be applications for this. For example, in industrial zones where you have already like hydrogen or really high calorific value gases kind of being pumped around. But I think I'd offer to any one of you here on the panel, if you ever wanted to write a paper on the history of the future of energy technologies, I think hydrogen and fusion would be top of my list. I would want to start with you over a beer.
Fusion, really.
Yeah,
We
this
talked
is like,
about it.
this is, it's always been the future. Like in 50 years, we're going to solve our energy problem through fusion, and that's been the case since, I don't know, the last, at least since I've been in the field, but probably the last 30, 40 years.
I would agree with that. It's always been 10 years away. And maybe just a note as well, I don't want to be always kind of negative here, but that if you are an entrepreneur that is really looking into the hydrogen space, and this is where you think you can bring a lot of value, I'll give you the feedback that, you know, entrepreneurs are really good when they do more with less compared to other entities, right? They are successful because they can leverage resources that end up resulting in a lot more value. But in a space like hydrogen, by definition, you do need a lot of support from existing infrastructure, from utilities, from manufacturing. So what exactly is your innovation that you could do aside or separate from all of these other players? And be kind of realistic about that, and realizing, are you looking for partners? Are you looking for funding? Are you looking for customers? Because hydrogen is different than, you know, building an app or building a software model. You will need a lot of resources to come on board, even for your first pilot plant, and be realistic about that. It's a great mission. I think there's room to do, but also there's a lot of people trying to work at it in R&D companies, in labs, in universities. So kind of go in with your eyes wide open that this is not something that just waiting on one idea. It takes a lot more than that.
Yeah. So somebody asked if there are any technologies that reduce auto emissions or capture car emissions on the freeway. I can think of one: electric cars. How about you folks? What else is out there? Because that's probably a big problem, right? Just auto emissions.
While the car is driving, I mean, yeah, biofuels were another one that we used to talk about.
Right.
It's still an option.
Is it still an option? I mean, I just don't hear much about, you know, alcohol fuels anymore. Is that why is that?
I think California is still, or I don't know if it's shifted now, but reducing more emissions by adding ethanol to gasoline than electric vehicles.
Okay, so that's still a thing.
It's still a thing.
All right. You know, somebody asked here if we think that maybe there's something in the market that could change that would help. Like, are we going to change the way we pay for energy in the future? I think we might have to, given what's going on in the economy right now. But is that a change that might lead to the acceleration of investment in energy? Does anybody have a comment on that? Because if not, go ahead.
I do very much. Yes, I would say the way we, as on the wholesale market and on the retail market, the way we pay and price electricity and energy in general is going through and will be changing quite a bit. Again, there is kind of top level changes given the mix. When you're next, if you imagine the world that there's no more coal or gas plants, the price that solar needs to be at will be the next solar plant. So pricing of these solar and wind projects will be very different. Valuing and pricing storage will be very different. And from our research side of things, we're looking at how then to do dynamic pricing, capacity pricing, flexibility pricing. So even at the customer level, people have been looking into, and there's a lot of startups that are trying to do peer-to-peer between residents and things like that. So yes, in the future, your electricity bill might have a very different look and feel to it, and it does already now. If you are in one of the Bay Area who are in the what is it called, the clean energy, the city utilities, the CCAs, sorry, the CCAs, they're very different from PG&E and what they do and things like that. So yes, the pricing mechanism and pricing actual values will be variables as well, will be very different, and because of many reasons. Yeah. So if you have ideas around that, if there's better ways to do that and you're working into it, it's definitely a very interesting space.
Anything else? This is actually a really good question, although I had to read it several times to believe that it is. But somebody asked, they've got an idea, it's a wind tech idea, but it's going to require millions and millions of dollars, you know, $10 million at least to develop and prototype it. Now, I remember hearing this all the time back when I did a lot of clean tech stuff. So we got this great idea, going to take $100 million though to prove it. What's a company like that going to do? How are they going to get funded? How are they going to get that kind of big money? Should they even be approaching folks like you if it's going to, I mean, 10 million, I think is probably in your range, but a lot of these technologies, they require 100 million or more. Should they even be talking to someone like you if they've got an idea that big? And if so, what is the funding strategy?
So I think we as this collective group, this is speaking for all three of us, are probably not the right folks to approach first. I'd give the advice of really look around for the non-dilutive funding if you can. And if you really have an idea that is going to change and reduce like gigatons of CO2, there are folks like our friends at Breakthrough Energy who might be the right people to talk to. But I think exploring the path of at least getting to some proof points and some pilots using grant funding is the way to go.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between needing to raise 10 to 20 million to get from idea all the way through to product launch and sales versus needing 10 to 20 million to just do some prototyping. And what I would say to somebody who says, well, I need 10 or 20 million just to do some prototyping is say, figure out how to do it with 10% of that. Because the burden is just the bar is so high. And there's got to be a way, right? You go talk to your prospective customers, get them involved, see if they're willing to pay you for some of that development. Make sure that the pain point that you solve is big enough. Make sure that the impact that your technology will have is meaningful. You know, you'd be surprised how many times somebody comes to us and says, well, we solve this problem and we make it better by whatever percent. And then we go and do some informal diligence and we talk to those customers and we say, hey, if someone could solve this problem and move the needle by X percent, would it matter? And a lot of times they say, well, not really, right? So in order for us to adopt something like that to some other points that were made before, we'd have to change this and this and this and this to accommodate it. And we're not going to do that. The cost benefit doesn't make sense. When we find that thing that we go talk to customers and they say, oh my gosh, that would be great. Even a small percent improvement would be a big difference for us. It would make, it would make it worthwhile for us to switch. Then that entrepreneur is onto something. And then we know exactly what we're aiming at and where we need to, like, what do we need to show in order to get some other people involved, other investors, other customers, other technology development partners, research partners, and it really takes a village. So I think being realistic about what do you actually need to achieve and what's the best, most efficient path to get there.
Okay, this is a little more general question here. Somebody asks about, because remote working, everything's different now, we're all sheltering. Is that changing your portfolio targets or what you look for in a company or what you're investing in at all?
Well, I think I talked about it a little earlier that we've invested in 2 companies that work on that remote worker enablement, not us sitting in front of Zoom calls, but actually people out in the field servicing the substations, turbines, and equipment that needs to be serviced out there. So that's kind of, if you have an idea in that framework, that's just will help you get to faster adoption. And I think that across the industry, we see at least a slight uptick in path to digitization of how business is done. So there's actually an opportunity there. From our portfolio view, I think we've always been looking for people who like can work. If they choose to work all in one location and have that team all on site, that's great. We've invested in companies that have a lot of remote workforce already, and that is also working well. So we don't we don't ask or tell teams to do one or the other. It needs to work for them, and they need to show that it works for them.
Okay. Well, again, Carolyn, you get the last word because we're at 1:30. So at this point, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you, attendees, for being here and asking such good questions. And I'm going to turn this back to Rob.
Great discussion, great insights, good stuff. Thank you, panels. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Osama, for being with us here today and sharing your great expertise. Roger, thanks for moderating. Audience members, thank you for tuning in, asking great questions. See you next time.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.